bit about some of the basics of Anvil. What is a track? What is an element? We also discussed how to record aspects of the video, how to create an element, how to make a track point. For this session, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about some of the technical aspects of Anvil. And specifically, I want to focus on the idea of the specification file, which is a critical concept for Anvil in the definition of codes and the way that we will eventually use this for the VNEN and define what exactly we want to capture. One thing I would like to say is that while I'm going into some details and giving a demonstration, there actually is very good material out on the Anvil website. Here is the Anvil webpage, www.anvil-software.org, and it actually has a lot of very interesting information, including things like video tutorials. So if I click on this button, we can see that there are different tutorials that are available on the basic concepts of Anvil, how to do an annotation file, coding scheme and track type, changing your coding, track types, and working with a specification file. The last two, track types and working with a specification file, are some of the things that I'll be talking about today. But this is, while it's in English, it's actually very useful, and the developer of the software actually gives his details of how to work with this tool. Now, what we can see here, as we'd seen before, is that we have four windows. We have a menu window that actually has the controls for the video. We have the video itself. We have a track definition window. And then we also have the annotation board. And again, hitting the play button, there's a green line that shows the starting point, and the red line is showing where the video is. We can see that since I already have one of the tracks highlighted, that it's creating a red bar here. And what I will do is I'll just quickly demonstrate a way to code something on one of our potential track groupings, which is the activity. And we have four activities here. We have class activity, we have group activity, we have pair activity, and we have individual activity. And I am going to not code this in an exact way. I want to more just demonstrate the way that we can start creating tracks, and then look at the attributes that those tracks have. So let's just say that we start here, and I want to classify this as class activity. I do a right click, and I say create, and we have our first element. Now let's just pretend that it now goes to group activity. And I want this to be group. I'm going to say create. Oops. Actually, let me delete that one. What I need to do first is click down here. And let's say that I want to make this be group activity. Now let's just say that from here it becomes that's pair activity. I'm going to label that. And let's say that it goes back to class activity. Oops. So this part I want to classify as class activity. So now, for this lesson, we have some different types. Now, let's say we want to get into defining exactly what type of interaction is taking place. So we actually have another grouping here. And for the class activity, we want to specify what type of interaction is taking place there. If I click down here on, for example, the group activity, you can see that it's actually not highlighting. And real quickly, my battery is running low. If you could just get my plug. So if I click on this area down here for group activity, nothing lights up. But if I click up here for class activity, we can see that there's a red bar that forms. And basically that's demonstrating that for this interaction grouping, I can only code class activity for the time that's already been defined as class activity. So I'm going to now create that element. And so what we can see is that we've got class activity, and now we have the interaction for the class activity below it. Now, actually, what I also want to do is define its attributes. And so I say edit, and what you can see here is I have options of what type of interaction it is. And let's just say that this is a teacher-only interaction. So I can select teacher, and I can say OK. And now that's defined as teacher. But now for this next one, for the group activity, if I click up on class activity for interaction, you can see that it doesn't light up. But if I click on the group activity, this bar lights up. So I'm going to create, but I'll actually just go straight into create and edit for this one. And what you can see is that it actually gives a lot of different options. And I've done this specifically to demonstrate that there's some different types of attributes that you might associate with these elements. First, you can define it, and we could say that this is first group interaction. And now it's asking things like, for group engagement, how much group engagement is taking place for this group interaction? And I might say that actually most of the students are participating, not all of them. And the group pace. Are all the students going at the same pace, or are different groups going at different paces? Let's say that actually there's a case where different groups are going different paces. I would select that. And then also the interaction type from the teacher perspective. What's the teacher doing? The teacher is observing, interacting, or maybe the teacher's not involved. Let's say that the teacher starts out observing. So now I click OK. And all of that information is now tied to that element. Now this has been defined as a special type of element that is allowed to be subdivided. So let's say that the teacher starts out just observing, but then maybe right at this point, the teacher starts to interact with the students. So you can actually subdivide this. And now let's just say that the teacher interacts. So we've started to define this. We've been able to break up this type of element. So what's going on here? Now let's look at the specification file to see how this has all been defined. So if I go to edit specification, we can see now that we have all of our different codes defined here. And we're working specifically with these, which is the activity type, and we have our class interaction, group interaction. And what you can see is these are defined as primary tracks. And that basically means that it's something you can start coding. It's not relying on any other sort of track. But then if we go down to the interaction type, we can actually see that there are subdivision tracks. And what this means is that, first of all, you can divide the track up into different sections. So you can define the element as a whole, but then you can split it up. And you can also see that there's an attribute tied to it. And in this case, it's class interaction type. And that for that, it's got some different codes defined. Teacher, teacher and student, or student. And if you remember, we chose to define this as teacher. Now, if we go to the group, now we can see that actually 3 different track attributes were defined for this one. And if you remember, we had engagement, what was happening. We also had the pace, and we had the interaction type, whether the teacher's observing, interacting, or no interaction. So what you can see is that this specification file is defining how we can work on coding this video. And these are specifically capturing the attributes that we've defined in the specification file. So let's just look at some basic steps on what we could do. First of all, let's say that we want to create a new group. What we can do here, let's just say that we want to create the new group as a completely separate group, not tied to any of these others. And I'm going to just hit add group, and we'll just call this sample. And now, within that group, I'm going to define new tracks. And let's just call this track 1. And we'll call that a primary track. And we'll add a new track, track 2. And we'll again call that let's call this one a subdivision. And then also let's just create one more. And this one, let's call this a primary point. And so now we have 3 new tracks defined. Maybe we want to give these tracks some attributes. We can add attributes, and we can define new ones, or actually if there are already predefined attributes, we can pick from those. Now let's just say that we want to make this a value set, and we'll just call it value. And we're calling this a new user-defined. And what we can do is we can tie this to a value set that already exists, or we can define our new one. And let's say that we're doing the new one. And now let's edit that value. And I'm going to go into the value set editor, and I'm going to add a new value. And we'll just call this A1. And we can specify a color for it. And we can add another one, B1. And again, we can add a color for it. And so now we have a new attribute. Let's add another one. And in this case, let's just say that it's Boolean, true, false. And now I'm just going to close this. Now this is on track 1. And actually, why don't I add something to the point attribute as well? Let's say that this one we already know that we want to use a value set that's already been defined. And let's say that this is based on student engagement. And so you can see that it's automatically populated here. And so now I'm going to close this and say that I want to save. One thing that you'll notice is that the file itself does not, the attribute file that's open right now does not capture all of those changes that we just made. And the way that we have to capture those new changes is to actually reopen with the new the newly defined specification file. So I'm going to just basically say so I'll just save my Anvil file, example spec. Now I'm going to reopen the same video. I'm going to choose the same specification name because I did not change the specification name. Track 1 already exists. So what I'm going to need to do is edit this file, and this is actually a good chance to explain how you can edit a specification file in a different way. Because it's not opening there automatically, I'm going to just go into the specification file separately. And here's the one that we were working with. I'm going to open it with XML editor. And now we can actually see that there is code behind that specification file. And it said that track 1 already existed, so I chose a name that already existed, so I need to change that. And here is where my new specifications are. I gave a group of sample. You can see I have track 1 here, and what I'm going to do is just change this to track 1.1 and track 1.2. Now I'm going to save it, and now let's see if it lets me open up the file. Okay, track 1.1. Okay, so now I have a new error. So I now need to go back to it. And it's basically saying that it doesn't have a reference. So I'm actually looking for the reason why that's happening. Not a reference track. So I think what I'm going to do is just remove that. And let's see if we can try it now. And if we go down to the bottom, we can see that we have our track 1-1 and point. And now let's just create a new element there and edit it. And if you remember, we asked that a Boolean be given. And so it's true, false. So if I check the box, it's saying that's true. And let's say that I just think that it has the value A1. So now our element is defined that way. And if you see here in the element window, it actually shows how I've defined that attribute. Now let's say that we want to create a point. And I've created it. Now let's say I want to edit it. In this case, we said that there was engage 1, and as you can see, it's holding the attributes that we defined. And let's say that all students are participating. So in this case, what we've done is we've created a new type of element, and we've defined a new type of track point, and we've tied attributes to it. And we've done that through the specification file. And actually, because of an error that I made, we actually got to see that you can edit the specification file alternatively through the XML editor or even the Notepad, where you can go into the code itself. So that actually gave a good opportunity to see that it's not just the edit specification that you can use, but you can actually go into the file itself and change it. So hopefully that gives a bit of an idea of some of the basics about the specification. One thing that I'd like to just point out quickly is, let's see here, that we had our grouping and our class activity, and you saw how that was coded. And what would the edit specification, or what would the specification on that look like? So if you remember, here's class, here's interaction type, here's group, it's a subdivision track, and it has multiple track attributes. So I guess I spoke about this a little bit earlier, but just as a reinforcement, all of these tracks can have no attributes. They can have a single attribute. They can have multiple attributes. You can define it however you want. You can also define a track to be tied to a different track. And in this case, the group track is tied to the group class. So this is what was preventing us from being able to record, for example, a class interaction in the group interaction type. So we actually had to define first that there was some class interaction or some group interaction, and then we were able to go into the details of we needed to decide that it was a group activity, and then define that it's actually got group interaction and what sort of group interaction was taking place there. So there are these links to different tracks that we can define. So that's just to give an idea of the specification file and different ways that you can edit it. Now, there's also the issue of eventually needing to do analysis with this data. And while Anvil does have a little bit of some basic analysis, it's actually not very robust. So there's an alternative way to just get the data out of Anvil and be able to put it into a separate file. Maybe Excel is a good one, and then actually do the analysis separately there. So the way that you can do that is to simply export. So file, export, and what you can do is export, if you want all of the details, export annotation frame by frame. So I'm going to click on this, and I'm going to specify a few options. I'm just going to take the default options and export example. And I'll just save it on the desktop. So now it's exported, and really we don't have too much here. We've defined the track here, and we've defined a point here. So let's just now go to the file that we created. And what we can see is it's a kind of a messy looking file, right? We've got a lot of different things up here. It doesn't make much sense when you're just looking at it like this, but what it's doing is it's exporting all of the different tracks, and then it's also defining when those tracks were being used. So let's just copy all of this. And so I should do it this way. Edit copy. Now let's go to Excel. And let's open a new window, a new file. And I'm going to paste. And actually up here, it's not showing the Vietnamese very well, but it's basically showing that these are the names of the different tracks. This is frame by frame, and this is the time. And most of it is blank because most of our file is blank. But if we go here, we can see that actually for the sample track 1 and the sample track 1 boolean and the sample track 1 value, those are the things that we coded, and it shows up here. What I'm going to do is get this to the beginning. What we can see is that for about 8.2 seconds is when it started through 12.96 seconds. All of these were coded as ones, meaning it's been recorded in Anvil. So if we go back to the track type itself, or sorry, the annotation board, and we expand, we can see that it's 8 seconds to about 12 seconds is when that got recorded. So what it's doing is it's basically showing that that track was recorded for those time frames. And if you were to actually fill out this coding fully, you would have a lot of detail. We basically just did a very simple example, but the negative 1000 is indicating nothing was recorded. The 1 is saying that yes, it was recorded. And from here, we can actually do something in Excel to get more details for how to display that information. And what I'm going to do is actually just show something that we did in the Indonesian case. For Indonesia, there was something similar where the file could be produced from the software with all of the details of the different codes and the time, a start time and an end time. And what we did is we created an Excel file that would capture, when something's happening during a class period, a point in the video, mark that. And what you can see here is this was video 1, video 2, video 3. For each of these videos, we have all of the details of what was coded. And this green mark is indicating that at that point, this type of code was used. And then from there, we summarized it. So anytime there was mathematics time, here you can see that it was marked. It's coming from one of the codes down below, basically saying if a code down below was marked as mathematics time, indicate that it happened at this point. So it's a way of basically summarizing what happened in the Indonesian classrooms. But then from there, we can even summarize it further. This is actually taking all of those 100 classrooms, not worrying about specific time points, but just the amount of time that was spent. And if we zoom in, what it's now saying is for mathematics time, 89% of the class time for all of these 100 videos on average was used for mathematics, 3% for non-mathematics, mathematics organization time. So basically, what we're doing is we're taking the outputs from the videos, we're putting it into an Excel spreadsheet, combining it, and then being able to do different types of analysis on it. Another is, well, maybe we do care about time points, but we want to know across all 100 videos what was happening. So what we did is we created a way to summarize what was happening and across all 100 videos. And what you can see here is we have review, new material, practice, and assessment as one of our coding groups. And for Indonesia's classrooms, the class tends to begin with review, but review after about 30% of the class, it's rare. Whereas practice doesn't necessarily immediately happen in the beginning, but it actually starts up after a period of time. That was new material. Practice tends to happen after the new material, and then assessment's very rare. But basically, we can see that the pattern is that it begins with review. New material tends to be introduced towards the middle, or towards the after about 20% of the classroom time has passed, and then it moves into practice. And that's Indonesia's lesson signature, their pattern. Now, what's important isn't the analysis itself, but just to see that what you can do is take data from the software tool, export it, put it into an Excel file, and then by defining the Excel file as being able to take that data and summarize it and do different things with it, you can actually do a lot of interesting analysis. You can also easily put this into a format where you could use it for regression analysis in something like R or SPSS or Stata. So it's very easy to just take the data in an exported form and make use of it. One thing that I also just want to demonstrate that is really important from a standpoint of coding is the concept of inter-rater reliability. And really what that means in a nutshell is that different coders should code the videos in the same way. If you have people interpreting what's happening in the video differently, and that they would code differently, it means that you can't necessarily compare their analysis. If they're coding two different videos, you don't know if that other coder would have coded the first video in the same way that the other coder would have. And when you have a team of, say, 6 or 10 coders, it becomes just that much more important that you have inter-rater reliability. So one thing that we did for Indonesia was we created a spreadsheet that helped us determine whether coders were coding in the same way. And here we have one coder's name, Puji, Rahmadi, Erwin, Ning, Ade. So what we did is we took their outputs from the video software tool and we put it into Excel, and then we were able to summarize it. So in this case, they all coded the same video. They all looked at one video and coded by themselves, and then we were able to get their outputs and put it into the software tool, or put it into Excel, and analyze it and determine whether they coded in the same way. And you can actually do this in a summarized way of using a kappa, but from the standpoint of coding layer by layer, it's also really useful to see where they might be coding differently, where they might be coding the same way. So here is our summarized version. And again, we've got mathematics, non-mathematics, and mathematics organization. We have our 5 coders, and we see what they did for the coding of the videos. And these are time points, and we can see that all of the coders started out coding the beginning as non-mathematics time, and then by this point they switched to mathematics. There was a little bit of a discrepancy here where one coder thought that this was still mathematics time, but other coders thought it was organization time. But for the most part, this layer, if we look at it from a zoomed out view, you can see that they almost always coded the same way. At this point, it was very clear that everybody decided this was mathematical organization. Then it became mathematics again. So for the most part, that layer was very reliable. If we go down to the next layer, one thing that's very interesting to note is mathematical organization should not get a code for whether this is review, new material, practice, or assessment. So you can see that it's blank here because this was coded as organization. It meant that down below there should be no coding for what type of activity it was in terms of review, new material, practice, and assessment. And that was because that's how we defined the coding tree. But what we can also see is, for example, here, there seems to be a bit of a problem. While at the beginning everybody's coding the same way, it's very clear that at this point something changed. Two of the coders thought it was review, whereas the remaining 5 coders saw it as practice time. Now, this was used as a pilot, and this was a way that we could design or determine whether everybody started having the same ideas in terms of these codes. And at this point in our practicing, the coders had different ideas of some of these codes. And so we were able to identify where they had differences of opinion and have discussions. And based on those discussions, either refine the definition, make it clearer, but at the end, everybody needed to have the same idea of exactly what we meant by review, what we meant by practice. So this was a very useful way of looking at whether coders were coding in the same way. And you can see that for some of these layers, I won't go into all of the layers, the coders had more difficulty than others. And it was the codes that had required a greater amount of judgment on the part of the coders. That's where we tended to have differences in opinion. And so lower inference codes, lower inference tracks, those are the easier ones to code. Those are the ones that are more likely to have all the same results. Higher inference codes are more challenging. And so if we were to think about from this workshop, some of the activities that, or some of the potential codes that we worked on, we were doing basic things like, is it group activity, is it class activity, is it pair or is it individual? And most likely we won't find too many differences there. But then we started getting into discussions of the level of student engagement and whether all students are engaged or most or half or some. That starts to get to be a little bit more difficult, and that's where you might start seeing differences in determining how to code it. And then we're actually also talking about quality. And this is where it's going to be even more challenging, trying to determine whether what the teacher is doing or what's happening in the classroom is high quality or advanced, or is it beginning? These are going to be things that coders will need to come up with reasons why they think it's higher or lower quality. And the way that we need to do this is try to define as much as possible what do we mean by an advanced or a high quality instance. And so the more that everybody has the same idea of what those are, the more likely we're going to be able to come up with the same sort of coding. But that's going to be one of the challenges as we move forward and work with some of these codes that we're defining. We need to make sure that there's codes that are everybody can agree on, that everybody understands the criteria to be used, and that they would be making the same determination based on those codes. But in talking about this, maybe one very important thing that we can do with this is, especially for times where a judgment is required, what I would suggest is that a comment always be written attached to it. So if, let's say that we want to provide a certain code. We want to call this A1. and let's just say that's high quality. What would be good to do is actually capture an explanation of why, as a coder, I came up with the determination that this is A1. Or if I think that it's B1, why do I think that it's B1? So when other people go back to the video and look at it, they can see what the reasoning was of why the coder came up with that definition. So those are some of the things that we can think about as we start to define the coding tree more, as we think about how to manage the specification file. How exactly we define our coding scheme and how it is most useful from a coder's perspective, as well as from an analyst's perspective. So hopefully this is of some use in understanding a little bit better how to not just code, but what's happening behind the coding. And if you are somebody who is expected to manage the specification file and actually be able to enter in new types of codes and define new attributes, hopefully this will give an idea of what those steps can be. And then we went into the alternative way of looking at the specification file with the XML and editing it here in the code itself rather than specifically in the specification file. And sometimes this is an even easier way to edit and create new codes rather than going through the process of the specification file. So you have two alternatives there. And then finally, we discussed about the way that you can take the output from Anvil and actually make use of it. So hopefully that at least gives a starting point for understanding what's happening and how to best use the information that comes out.